First of all, can you hear me? You want me to use this one?
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, now I got it. So tonight, Joyce is my boss because she's going to keep me on time here. I want to just reflect for a moment on the prior speakers here, the previous speakers, who I think have delivered on what the planning staff had hoped for this evening, which was to spark some ideas. I really appreciated going back to the first principles for the beginning of the district here, the lived experience of growing up 2 generations in the neighborhood, and the kind of landscape orientation and principles and precedents from Southeast False Creek, I think, are interesting looking forward. So I think my job is to talk about the future, and I'm not here to unveil the plan, ta-da, here it is, this is your future, folks, but really to kind of help set the stage for that and frame it in a way. So that's what I hope to do. I also wanted to just acknowledge what an honor personally it is for me to bracket Ray Spaxman as a director of planning to another director of planning a few decades apart. Ray and I have had the opportunity to have a few conversations since I arrived about a year ago, and I think we've found almost immediately a real spiritual connection, I think, a like-mindedness in our approach. And though I'm actively pursuing this current position here, my planning career actually began back in the 70s. And I had the distinct honor and pleasure of meeting and conversing with, on multiple occasions, 3 of the 4 experts that you mentioned there before, some of those thought leaders, Jane Jacobs, Christopher Alexander, and Ian McHarg. And they really helped form my thinking. And so just to let you know where I'm coming from and where the department is coming from is a very people-oriented planning. That is to say, we really start with that. And so what we heard about the founding principles for this district around a mix of people, of incomes, of generations, of household types and tenures, a mix of uses is really a wonderful starting point, and I think that's what we're here to try to carry forward. And the job with you all ahead of us is really to articulate how that will work. How will that carry forward in the coming decades with a whole set of new challenges that frankly weren't here in the 1970s. So with that little intro, I think we'll kind of move through the slide deck here, and I'll try to go through this pretty quickly. I wanted to just mention the context for which we're looking at this partially is not simply a neighborhood effort, but that it resides within a larger geography here that we're really calling the city core, and wondering what the city core, which is really the urban heart of the entire metropolitan region, ought to be in the year 2050. And this is a critical part, and actually is a simultaneous planning effort with that larger context, as is some other localized planning efforts that we need to tie together under a larger framework to really step forward. And I noted the word transformation or transformational in your presentation, Margot, and I think that is the moment right now we are in, which is really needing to think about how we don't react to transformational change that's already happening to us, but how we intentionally guide that. And so again, looking forward into the future, what do we see? This young person here will be of prime age in 2050, and what will he and his classmates inherit from our decisions today? So taking stock of kind of what's on the ground now, there are certainly a tapestry of neighborhoods, historic, new, continuing, that are places to live. And again, Vancouver is remarkable in its urban development in terms of having very urban living opportunities, and led much of the world in that regard, at least in the current century and the end of the last one. Also, lots of places to work, and that work, the nature of work is evolving. And that partly will influence the future of a mix of uses in False Creek South. So again, a parallel effort here is to think about how this neighborhood also fits in with that larger context, while also keeping its character and its principles. So looking at the larger challenges within that city core, clearly, as was mentioned by Margot, sea level rise is one of those, climate change in general. The slide on the upper left there shows the inundation mark for waters that may occur, flooding that may occur by mid-century, and by end of century, I think we're potentially well beyond that. And of course, everybody knows the markings on the Canby Bridge. On the right-hand side is actually a response to Hurricane Sandy in Manhattan. This is a Manhattan design competition that was throughout the New York metropolitan area, and one kind of creative and radical, bold response to dealing with that phenomenon that I think Ian McHarg would actually embrace. Certainly the notion of a housing crisis is prevalent and is top of mind for everyone. What can we learn from the historic experiment of False Creek South in terms of addressing housing demands going forward, demands for a mix of living and a mix of types of tenure and a mix of income levels? So we're busy working on a citywide housing strategy that we'll be delivering to council at the end of this month that will help inform this effort. We know that many parts of the city's core are still dealing with historic levels of poverty. One of those neighborhoods is the poorest postal code in Canada. So this is not just all happy. This is, we really need to take care of people, many of whom are quite desperate. There are also challenges with mobility. The era of the single occupant gas-powered vehicle is kind of coming to an end rather quickly, probably more quickly than we even realize. And the notion of having options in mobility is really important. And here's one indicator of one of those kinds of options, which is actually augmenting what's here as the TransLink SkyTrain system with more localized streetcar that could run throughout that city core and beyond, including running alongside False Creek South. We have an initiative that we've just begun in the downtown this year through planning with colleagues in engineering called Places for People, and we're really studying how people want to use the spaces in between buildings, whether those are publicly owned or privately owned, and really making this our common living room. False Creek South is very rich in the amount of land dedicated to public space. How does that kind of fabric stitch its way and retain itself into the neighborhood as it is rebuilt? And how does it really provide for even more opportunities for social interaction going forward? I think is a question, and a question throughout the city core. So we sort of seized through a number of conversations, at least while I've been here, a sense of what the primary desired attributes of a city core future would be, and these are some of those. Here are some additional ones. These attributes keep coming up conversation after conversation. In some ways, they're a local voice echo of what Margot presented from the national conference that she attended. And we have some building blocks. We're not starting the False Creek planning process here only with just starting from scratch discussions with you all, but we're actually bringing to that dialogue some pretty robust city community dialogue that's already occurred and resulted in some new policy frameworks here that I think will be very helpful, including the Housing Vancouver strategy, the Greenest City, and the Healthy City strategies are all pertinent policy frameworks. So in my last couple minutes here, just wanted to touch on what we see are some opportunities for thinking about the False Creek South future. One is to improve the connections between the neighborhood and the surrounding neighborhoods and the city fabric. Part of that might be done with the streetcar, but part of it may be done with a road network and pedestrian ways. 6th Avenue in some ways is an isolator and a barrier. Again, looking at those landscape opportunities and taking those to the next level of sort of living with water, which is part of our future with climate change, and doing that in an elegant and people-friendly way. Again, and here's where I think the False Creek South really made a mark for Vancouver in general. It's not all one type of housing, not one physical form of housing, and certainly not one type of tenure or affordability. It's deliberately a mix. So how do we keep that going forward, even as we deal with today's real estate economics? And those are the tough pieces that we inherited here, is a different economic climate where, frankly, there isn't as much federal support for housing. We all hope for more, of course. And the notion here of really making lively neighborhoods and scaling that to an appropriate scale that works for this district. It is a place for both local residents and for citywide interests and even visitors. And how do we celebrate that? And what are those key neighborhood qualities that we really want to carry forward here? And I think these images reflect some of that. So I think what we are hoping to do going forward, this is the first of many conversations to be had over the coming months and year with the community here. This is some images from a very soft launch we did last summer that Karis organized, which I think even had barbecue as part of it, to really just sort of open up to ideas. And there were student participants in this day. It was helped organized with Replan's participation in organizing that event. Very effective, I think, in sort of kicking off with a kind of spirit that we want to see imbued throughout the process here going forward. So we'd like to tap into various sources and means of promoting that conversation. And so these are just some of those. So for us, the next steps are really hearkening back to what Ray opened with, which is engaging you in a discussion about what are the core principles that ought to design our process going forward. And those extend to not only the physical planning, but also many of those other pieces that we referred to, including the transition from current leases into new situations and new leases and so forth. As well as to take what's maybe the easiest part first in terms of physical planning, which would be the edge of the district, where there is no disruption to existing residents or housing, and tackling that future of that streetcar idea, laying down some tracks, as it were, there, as well as thinking about some of the more immediate opportunities, even for street connections. And to deliver this resident protection plan. Again, the council has asked us to make sure there's a baseline safety net and guarantees for people in the neighborhood that there will be affordable options to remain in the district, even as it gradually transitions to something new. So I will end there, and that's just sort of a preview of what's ahead, and want to again thank our prior speakers for teeing it up. Thank you.